Save me from the nightmare I've become. Was that off key? More than likely. Hi everyone, welcome to my recap and review of the very wild third episode in season 2 of The Rehearsal, Pilot's Code. Let's get into it. Nature versus nurture. Nathan opens the episode by saying that he's more comfortable doing his experiments on animals. We later learn that the scene we see of a couple sitting on a couch and watching TV with their dog is a part of the experiment. Here we meet Monique and Bogdan, who have cloned their late dog Achilles. The clone procedure produced 3 dogs, Apollo, Zeus, and Theseus. I want to note that Nathan seems genuinely comfortable with this couple. I think he actually met them before the show and he actually has a pre-existing relationship with them. Anyway, we get to the dilemma. Despite cloning their dog, the clones have very different personalities than their predecessors, Achilles. Nathan posits that this is because of their different upbringing. We learned that when Achilles was around, Monique stayed at home and was exclusively a pet parrot. There's a weird moment where she mentions them not being able to afford cloning at the time that she stayed at home, which prompts a nudge from Bogdan. Now, both me and Nathan find this interesting, but I just think it's cultural. Bogdan may be embarrassed about the fact that they didn't have money back then. He seems to have an audible accent, and it's possible that he comes from a culture where lack of money, even if discussed in the past tense, is a reflection of someone's morality as opposed to simply a moment in life. It's wild because it's clear that Bogdan was supporting both him and Monique, so that's something to be proud of in and of itself, even if they're not able to live very comfortably in that time period. So that was just a weird moment, but I genuinely think it was an innocent, like, hey, we shouldn't expose too much of our lives. And we learned that today, Monique is out of the house from 8 p.m. to 2 a.m. for her DJing gigs. Honestly, shout out to her for finding her passion. Bogdan also worked from home as opposed to going into the office as he previously did when Achilles was around. Nathan stages the couple's past life to see if he can nurture their clone dog into becoming more like Achilles. As the couple debriefs about their past life, Monique spills that she actually wanted to have children, but they were not ready. This made me pause the show because I truly can't imagine that devastation of loving someone, but knowing that they don't want children while you do. I personally don't want children, but yeah, it's just probably a devastating realization. People always callously talk about breaking up with people if they have different perspectives on having children, but the reality is a lot more difficult. Dating is hard. You do fall in love with this person. You do have emotions with this person, and I think it does prompt people to genuinely determine whether or not they're willing to live a life without a child than they are, being with this person that they have fallen in love with. And it's so easy to say, well, just break up with this person and find someone that's willing to have a child with you, but you don't know who else is out there. And the person that you end up having a child with could be, just a worse partner overall, and your life and your quality of life can decline tenfold. And I don't think people talk about that enough, that is actually a genuinely hard decision to make. And yes, it can be a black and white line for most people, but the reality is a lot harder than those, conversations that people have online. Anyway, in the experiment, Nathan goes to extreme lengths, including collecting air from San Jose and transporting it to Los Angeles. He hires actors to represent tech bros in the early 2010s and even has a Subway ad with the now disgraced Jared Fogle. One of the key aspects of Achilles was his ability to care for Monique during her diabetic attacks, but the clone does not respond to the reenacted attacks. The actors also start mirroring what they believe to have been the arguments between the couple. Monique is explicit with about the fact that they fought about having children and that Bogdan was devoted to work. The couple's dynamic is so fascinating to me. Bogdan is this reserved and meticulous individual, while Monique seems gregarious and expressive. But I think honestly, these couples always work out the best because they truly balance themselves out. And there's this moment when Zeus is just walking on the couch while the fake couple reenact the moment where Monique discovers her love of DJing. Monique is emotional watching the recording, and it really touched me. Maybe it's because before DJing, she had a difficult time in life. Either way, it was truly touching. So I just thought like she was crying and she was like referencing Zeus, but I do think that she was also talking about this moment where she discovers something that is now a very important part of her life. Somehow Nathan ties this back to Jeff, the creepy pilot who was banned from every dating app. We go back to the conversation where Jeff believes that he was banned because he put in his bio that he didn't want to date trans women. Jeff claims that he's been fooled by trans women, and while I have no doubt that he's been under the wrong assumption about the trans identity of a woman he's dated, I also think it's likely because he didn't care about knowing anything about these women before actually getting them into bed. Essentially, Jeff creates an atmosphere where people can't communicate effectively with him. Nathan transitions to a conversation about how the atmosphere created by pilots can heavily affect the communication in the cockpit. He provides one case where a pilot did give room for feedback. The 2009 Sully Sullenberger Hudson River case, which I think is very well known by everybody, especially by the Tom Hanks reenactment in the film that he made about that incident. Sully was able to save everyone on his flight due to his quick thinking, but he also asked his first officer if he had any ideas during a critical moment. So now we get into the Sully rebirth. This is where things get crazy. In Sully's memoir, The Highest Duty, Sully considers his upbringing critical to his ability to save everyone on that Hudson flight. Logically, Nathan decides to become a baby and relive Sully's life. Nathan dresses in a baby diaper and then is nursed by a giant puppet monster. This is a theater of ridiculousness. These next scenes were so wild, but I think it's used not only for humor, but to also show the ridiculousness of asking people to change their nurture. And I think some conversations when people are like, change your aura, it's like, okay, what do you want me to do? Change every single aspect of my life? And maybe that's kind of what he's poking fun at. Anyway, Nathan essentially decides to get waterboarded by a puppet milk breast. That it was just a wild scene, and I have a picture of this here. I'm not monetized on YouTube. Maybe doing these things that I do, which I curse, I say the words that apparently you're not supposed to say, is one of the reasons I'm not monetized. But I suspect that's also because people don't watch my videos because they're not well edited. And who cares? Let's get back into the review. The creepiest actor was this person that played Sully's sister, and they had it on this mask. That was a thing of nightmares. I remember as a kid, I used to always be scared of like these simulacra humanoid type mask figures that they would have, and I lived in South Florida, so we went to Disney all the time. Yeah, I didn't like that. It was a little too much for me. Anyway, I feel like Sully or someone on his team had to know about this episode because the voiceover used throughout this episode is an excerpt from his audiobook, and I mean maybe it was just licensed to Nathan without realization of what that license was going to be used for. I really doubt the highest order, regardless of how popular Sully Sullenberger is not the most licensed out work. So whoever's in charge of licensing out his audiobook recordings was not looking thoroughly into what this was going to be, because they did not think a grown-ass 41-year-old man is going to get waterboarded by breast milk in the scene where right after you hear Sully's voice. Anyway, I just thought that was very hilarious to think about Sully and his team watching this and thinking, what is going on? For some reason, Nathan also has to reenact this flight that he had with his crush that Sully had in high school. Now, Sully says it was a sensual experience, and Nathan interprets this as requiring him to masturbate while flying with a robot version of his crush. Now, I don't actually think this happened, but again, this is where the humor really lies. I think the coolest scene was when Nathan reenacted Sully learning to mute his southern accent. I don't know why, but this is a story you hear a lot, especially from the past, of people like muting their accents in order to fit in. And despite that, you could still hear that twinge. And I think that's so cute. Anyway, if you have a regional accent anywhere in the world, please keep it. I think it's important. It's actually a way that people sustain culture as well as legacy. So if you do have an accent, as much, and I maybe I'm saying this because I have a Midwestern, even though I've never been to the Midwest, a Midwestern American accent, which allows me to navigate a lot of different spaces. But still, if you have a regional accent, keep that. The memoirist toes the laws of being real while not revealing anything that could be considered controversial. Nathan describes it as Sully presenting himself as someone with challenges that are relatable but never more than what he can handle. For example, Sully completely omits his first marriage and skips directly to his second one. Nathan found that as Sully, he wanted to talk about his feelings but couldn't because the memoir indicated that Sully found ways to cope without dealing those methodologies of coping. Nathan discovers that pilots are averse to talking about anything that could get the FAA involved because it could lead to a medical certificate revocation. At first, I dismissed the fear of talking about anything remotely related to mental health, but then I did remember there's several incidents of pilots deliberately crashing their planes as murder-suicide plots. For example, the 2015 Germanwings Flight 9525, where the co-pilot was deemed mentally unfit to fly by his own doctor, but because of the HIPAA violation, the co-pilot just restricted sharing that information with his employer, and then eventually he killed essentially himself and 150 other people in that crash. Still, there has to be some middle ground, and I hope that at least with the popularity of Nathan's show that there is some more availability for people to talk about these conversations. Wake me up. Anyway, Nathan starts inventing situations to see how Sully coped. This includes a scene where pilots are just having drug rangers in the pilot's lounge, one of the highlights of the episode. Nathan then connects Sully's coping mechanism with music consumption. Sully's interest in music coincides with the invention of the iPod. Nathan posits that Sully began to cope through listening to music. However, Evanescence makes a special appearance throughout the memoir. The song Bring Me to Life is the band's most famous song and is described by Nathan as the band's cry for help. Nathan reveals that there is a 23-second pause when Sully is not responding to anyone right before the crash landing. Nathan makes a convoluted theory that Sully was listening to the chorus of Evanescence during the silence. While this is definitely unlikely and clearly a joke, I wouldn't be surprised if Sully was singing the chorus to himself to appease his anxieties, because basically he was probably gonna die that day. I think that's also a really crazy thought to have. Both him and his co-pilot probably recognized, sure, maybe we land in the Hudson and we're all safe, but the far more likely answer, and what I think the reason why people consider it a miracle, is that everyone survived. And of course that is because Sully took an educated guess about what best to do. But I think a lot of people noted, I remember when this first happened, I was still in high school, actually middle school at the time. And people were talking about how he landed in the Hudson as well just because he didn't want to risk potentially killing other people. So he truly thought he was going to die in that moment. Nathan then says it's okay to admit that you can't do everything. He then starts a montage of speaking with pilots and recognizing that of all the groups he's reached out to, pilots had the highest response rate. The pilots discuss having hard times being on the road constantly and their past. The episode ends with Nathan going to a fake therapist's office. So here we have it, Nathan, a mental health advocate. Who would have thought? But seriously, I think Nathan has created probably one of the best PSAs about seeking mental health help, particularly for men who are taught to keep their emotions down. With that being said, I'll also say, as a woman, sometimes people are like, men are told to keep their emotions down. And I'm trying to think of any woman I know who's been raised in a context where they were allowed to express emotions. I think, honestly, it's just that women end up finding peer friends who they can express their emotions to, whereas men, I guess there is a difference. Men, it's more like it's still socially unacceptable even within their friend groups to express their emotions. Anyway, that was my recap and review of the Rehearsal Season 2, Episode 3, Pilot's Code. Until next time, this was Strategic Delusion.